November 20th, 1943, 0847 hours, 160 miles northwest of Tarawa Atoll. The deck of the USS Liscombe Bay shuddered beneath the boots of aviation machinist's mate Second Class Robert Hartley as the first wave of Grumman TBF Avengers roared into the dawn sky. The air tasted of salt and aviation fuel, that sharp metallic blend that clung to the back of the throat and reminded every man aboard that they were breathing war itself. Hartley watched the bombers climb into the coral-pink horizon, their wings catching the first light like polished steel, and he felt what every deck crew member felt in those moments before combat. A strange mixture of pride and dread, knowing that the planes would return, or they would not. Far below, in the ready rooms and mess decks, the pilots had already eaten their breakfasts of powdered eggs and coffee so strong it could strip paint. They had joked nervously, checked their watches, fingered the photographs tucked into their flight suits. They had done everything young men do when they know that within hours they might be dead. But none of them, not Hartley, not the pilots, not the admirals in their flag bridges, could have known that before the sun reached its zenith, the decks they launched from would become islands of desperation, and that the simple act of coming home would transform into a nightmare written in fire and drowning men. This is not a story about the glory of naval aviation. This is a story about what happens when the mathematics of war, fuel, distance, time, collide with the unforgiving physics of the ocean. Yet it is about young men who flew into battle believing their ship would be waiting, only to find the sea had swallowed it whole. It is about the moment when American industrial might, that vast engine of carriers and aircraft that seemed unstoppable, revealed its most terrifying vulnerability. That steel floats only as long as the water remains outside. By the autumn of 1943, the United States Navy had learned to wage war across distances that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The carrier task forces of the Central Pacific had become floating cities, bristling with aircraft, radar, and anti-aircraft guns. They could project power across hundreds of miles, striking enemy positions with a precision and ferocity that left Japanese commanders reeling. At the Essex-class carriers, those magnificent vessels displacing over 27,000 tons fully loaded, could carry 90 aircraft each. The smaller escort carriers, the Casablanca-class ships like Liscombe Bay, were more modest, 512 feet long, capable of 20 knots carrying 28 aircraft. But they were numerous, and they were everywhere, stitching the Pacific together with flight decks and fuel lines. The invasion of Tarawa was meant to be a proving ground for amphibious doctrine, a demonstration that American forces could seize even the most heavily fortified atolls. The Liscombe Bay was part of Task Group 52.3, assigned to provide air support for the Marines storming the beaches of BTO Island. The carrier's aircraft, Avengers and Wildcats, would bomb enemy positions, strafe pillboxes, and hunt for Japanese submarines that might threaten the invasion fleet. It was dangerous work, but the pilots had trained for this. They knew their aircraft, knew their targets, knew the coordinates where their ship would be waiting when they returned. What they did not know, what no one could have predicted with certainty, was that the ocean itself had become a hunting ground, and that beneath the waves, predators waited with a patience that no human could match. At 0510 hours on that same November morning, while Hartley and his fellow deck crew were still wiping sleep from their eyes, the Japanese submarine Uite-175 had maneuvered into position. Commander Sunao Tabata had been tracking the American task group for hours, listening to the throb of propellers through his sonar, waiting for the perfect geometry of attack. He was outnumbered, is outgunned and operating in waters thick with American destroyers. But he had torpedoes, and he had patience, and he had the kind of fatalistic courage that comes from knowing your nation is losing a war, and that every American ship you sink might buy your comrades one more day, one more week. The pilots launching from Liscombe Bay had no idea that their home was being stalked. They climbed into their cockpits, ran through their pre-flight checks, and lifted off into the morning, believing what all men must believe to function in war: that the machinery around them was solid, that the plans were sound, that someone, somewhere, had accounted for all the variables. The strikes against Tarawa were brutal and effective. The Avengers dropped their payloads on Japanese positions, and watching the explosions blossom like terrible flowers across the coral. The Wildcats strafed enemy emplacements, their .50 caliber machine guns chewing through sandbags and flesh with equal indifference. Radio chatter crackled with target confirmations, damage assessments, and the occasional terse announcement that a plane had taken fire and was heading back early. This was the rhythm of carrier warfare. Launch, strike, return. The cycle that had been repeated thousands of times across the Pacific. But at 0513 hours, while the aircraft were still over Tarawa, the rhythm shattered. Commander Tabata fired a spread of 3 torpedoes. The first 2 missed. The third struck Liscombe Bay near the aircraft bomb magazine. The explosion was not simply loud, it was a physical presence, a concussion that rolled across the water and was felt by ships 10 miles away. The bomb magazine detonated, and in an instant, 27,000 tons of steel and aviation fuel transformed into a fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air. Men who had been eating breakfast were vaporized. Men who had been sleeping were entombed in twisted metal before they could wake. The carrier's back broke, and within 23 minutes, the Liscombe Bay had slipped beneath the surface, taking 644 men with her. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Henry Mullenix, the task group commander. Among the dead was Captain Irving Wiltsey, the ship's commanding officer. Among the dead was Doris Miller, the Navy Cross recipient who had manned an anti-aircraft gun during Pearl Harbor despite having no formal training, and a black mess attendant who had become a symbol of courage and who now would become a symbol of sacrifice. But the dead, at least, did not have to face what came next. The pilots returning from Tarawa saw the smoke first, a towering black column that rose into the sky like a tombstone. Radio calls went unanswered. Designated rendezvous coordinates led only to empty ocean and floating debris. Some pilots, their fuel gauges dropping toward empty, circled the smoke, refusing to believe what their eyes showed them. Others, more pragmatic or perhaps more terrified, immediately began searching for alternative landing sites. The nearest American carrier was the USS Coral Sea, but she was already recovering her own aircraft and had limited deck space. The USS Corregidor and USS Anzio, sister escort carriers, were nearby, but they too were operating near capacity. The mathematics of carrier operations are unforgiving. Each aircraft requires a certain amount of deck space to land safely, a certain amount of time to be moved below or respotted, a certain amount of fuel to be replenished. There are only so many planes a deck can accommodate, only so many landing signals officers, only so many arresting wires, and there are only so many minutes of fuel in a tank. Aviation machinist's mate Robert Hartley was not on the Liscombe Bay when she died. He had been transferred to the Coral Sea 2 weeks earlier, a routine personnel reassignment that saved his life and condemned him to witness what followed. He stood on the deck as the first of the orphaned aircraft appeared, a Wildcat, its engine coughing, the propeller windmilling as the pilot tried to conserve every drop of fuel. The fighter made its approach too fast, desperate, and caught the number 2 wire with a jolt that snapped the pilot's head forward. But he was down. He was safe. The next aircraft was not so fortunate. An Avenger, its torpedo bay empty, its fuel gauge reading 0, attempted to land on the Corregidor. The pilot misjudged his altitude. Exhaustion, stress, the simple human inability to process too much terror at once, and came in high. The landing signal officer waved him off, but the pilot either did not see or could not respond. The Avenger struck the deck hard, bounced, and careened into the island superstructure. Aviation fuel ignited. Men screamed. His damage control parties rushed forward with fire hoses while the next aircraft in the landing pattern circled overhead, its pilot watching his only refuge burn. This is what the German soldiers at Stalingrad must have felt, waiting in the snow for supplies that never came. This is what the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal experienced, watching American ships unload tons of equipment while their own men starved. The horror of watching salvation from a distance, knowing it is there, knowing it is real, but being unable to reach it. Some pilots made the decision quickly. Rather than risk a fiery crash on a crowded deck, rather than attempt a landing with fumes in their tanks and trembling hands on the stick, they chose the water. They radioed their intentions, calm voices, as professional to the end, and then put their aircraft down in the ocean as gently as they could. The Wildcat, being a fighter, was nose-heavy and would flip forward upon impact, trapping the pilot in his cockpit as the ocean rushed in. The Avenger, larger and with a crew of 3, would sometimes float for a few seconds, giving the men a chance to scramble out onto the wings before the weight of the engine dragged it down. Destroyers raced to the crash sites, their crews throwing life rings and lowering boats. Some pilots were recovered, shivering and vomiting seawater, but alive. Others were never found, their aircraft vanishing into the depths so quickly that rescuers arrived to find only empty water and spreading oil slicks. There is a particular kind of mathematics to survival that has nothing to do with tactics or training. Yet it is the mathematics of seconds. How many seconds before the cockpit fills with water? How many seconds before hypothermia sets in? How many seconds before a man's will to live overcomes his body's surrender to exhaustion? The Pacific Ocean in November is not freezing, but it is cold enough. A man can survive for hours, theoretically, but theory has never kept a man's teeth from chattering, never kept his fingers from losing their grip on the life ring, never kept the darkness at the edge of his vision from closing in. By midday, the carriers had recovered most of the surviving aircraft. Deck crews worked with a frenzy born of desperation, pushing planes below, respotting others, making room for just one more landing. Hartley worked until his hands bled, hauling tie-down chains and guiding aircraft into impossibly tight spaces. Around him, men shouted coordinates and warnings, their voices hoarse, their faces streaked with sweat and oil. The smell of burning rubber and scorched metal hung in the air, mixing with the ever-present salt and fuel. In the ready rooms below, pilots who had landed safely sat in silence. Some smoked, some stared at nothing. One young ensign, barely 20 years old, wept openly while his squadron mates pretended not to notice. They had all seen the smoke. They had all circled over empty ocean, calling for a ship that would never answer. They had all felt the gut-twisting certainty that they were going to die not in combat, not in a dogfight with Zeros, but simply because they had run out of fuel and there was nowhere to land. This was the nightmare. Not death in battle, but death by abandonment. The carrier was supposed to be the constant, the fixed point in a chaotic war. It was home. It was safety. It was the place you returned to after facing the enemy. And when it vanished, when the ocean swallowed it whole, the pilots learned what it meant to be truly alone. The Japanese High Command had long understood this vulnerability. The entire Japanese naval aviation doctrine had been built around the concept of the carrier as the center of power, the irreplaceable asset that could project force across vast distances. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had famously said that in the first 6 months of war against the United States, Japan would run wild. After that, he could guarantee nothing. He understood that Japan's industrial capacity could not match America's, that every carrier lost was a loss that could not be replaced quickly. While the Americans seemed to produce new ships, as if they grew on trees. But Yamamoto had also understood the flip side of this equation, that American naval power, for all its might, rested on a foundation of steel and fuel. Sink the carriers, and the aircraft had nowhere to go. Cut the supply lines, and the great industrial machine would starve. It was a strategy born of desperation, but desperation had made Japan dangerous in the early months of the war. At Coral Sea, at Midway, the mathematics of carrier warfare had played out in brutal clarity. Each side hunted the other's flight decks, knowing that the first to land a killing blow would own the sky. By November 1943, the balance had shifted decisively in America's favor. But balance is not immunity. The Liscum Bay proved that even in the midst of overwhelming superiority, a single torpedo could create catastrophe. The American sailors and pilots had believed, truly believed, that their numbers made them invincible. They had so many carriers, so many aircraft, so much fuel and ammunition that it seemed impossible to lose. And yet, in 23 minutes, 644 men died, and the survivors learned that invincibility is a myth that exists only until reality intrudes. In the weeks following the sinking, the Navy conducted its investigations and wrote its reports. The official inquiry noted that the Liscum Bay had been operating in a submarine threat area without adequate destroyer escort in her immediate vicinity. It noted that the carrier's damage control procedures, while executed bravely, had been insufficient to save the ship once the bomb magazine exploded. Yet it made recommendations for improved anti-submarine patrols, for better compartmentalization of explosive materials, for enhanced training and damage control, but the report could not capture what the pilots felt, circling over empty ocean. It could not capture the moment when a man realizes that the thing he has staked his life on, the carrier, the deck, the promise of return, has been taken away. It could not capture the sound of an engine coughing its last, or the sight of a parachute drifting down toward the waves, or the radio calls that went unanswered because there was no one left to answer them. Robert Hartley survived the war. He returned home to Ohio, married, had 3 children, and worked for 40 years as a mechanic. He rarely spoke about the Pacific, and when he did, and it was always about the machines, the aircraft he had serviced, the engines he had repaired. He never spoke about the Liscum Bay. His daughter asked him once, years later, why he had been transferred off the ship just before it sank. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes distant, and said only, "Luck, just luck." Then he changed the subject and never returned to it. But late at night sometimes, his wife would wake to find him sitting by the window, staring out at nothing. She learned not to ask. Some experiences carve themselves so deeply into a man's soul that words become inadequate. Some nightmares do not need sleep to manifest. There is a symbolic weight to the image of an aircraft running out of fuel. The machine that represents power, mobility, and freedom becomes, in its final moments, nothing more than a falling object, subject to gravity and the indifferent pull of the ocean. The pilots who flew from the Liscum Bay that morning had embodied the American dream of technological supremacy. Young men in powerful machines, backed by the vast industrial might of a nation that could build faster, produce more, and outfight any enemy. They were the tip of the spear, the sharp edge of democracy's arsenal. And yet, when the carrier vanished, all that power became meaningless. The Wildcat, capable of 330 miles per hour, could not fly on empty tanks. The Avenger, able to carry a 2,000-pound torpedo, could not stay aloft on fumes. The most advanced aircraft in the world became gliders, then coffins, descending into the Pacific with the inevitability of a stone. And this is the darker truth about American abundance, that it creates dependencies even as it provides freedom. The pilots relied on the carrier not just for a place to land, but for fuel, ammunition, food, sleep, maintenance. The carrier was the lifeline that made their missions possible. Sever that lifeline, and the entire system collapses. The Japanese soldiers fighting in the Pacific Islands had learned this truth earlier. watching their supply convoys get sunk, their garrisons starve, their wounded die for lack of medicine. But the Americans had believed themselves immune to such vulnerabilities. They had so much of everything that the idea of scarcity seemed foreign. The Liscum Bay taught them otherwise. In the years after the war, the Navy built more carriers, bigger carriers, with better armor and improved damage control systems. The Midway-class ships, laid down even before the Liscum Bay sank, displaced 45,000 tons and could carry 130 aircraft. The Forrestal-class supercarriers of the 1950s were even larger, floating cities that could operate independently for months. The lessons of Tarawa, of Liscum Bay, of every carrier lost in the Pacific were incorporated into designs that made the flight deck more survivable, the fuel storage safer, the crew more able to respond to catastrophic damage. But no amount of engineering can eliminate risk. Every carrier that launches aircraft accepts the fundamental bargain of naval aviation, that steel and fuel and human endurance have limits, and that the ocean is patient and unforgiving. Yet the pilots who fly from modern carriers, launching from nuclear-powered decks with steam catapults and radar-guided landing systems, still face the same essential equation that confronted the men of the Liscum Bay. Go out, complete the mission, come back. And if the deck is not there when you return, then all the training, all the technology, all the courage in the world cannot save you from gravity and water. There is a memorial at the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, a quiet place of white stone and carefully tended grass. Among the thousands of names etched into marble is a section dedicated to the men of the USS Liscum Bay. Visitors come, sometimes, to trace fingers over names, to leave flowers, to stand in silence and remember men they never knew. The marble does not record the terror of those final minutes. It does not capture the screams or the heat or the way the water rushed in, cold and absolute. It offers only names, ranks, dates, the bare facts of who they were and when they died. But if you stand there long enough, if you close your eyes and listen to the wind moving through the trees, you can almost imagine it. The rumble of engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the shouts of deck crews preparing for launch. You can imagine young men, boys really, most of them, climbing into cockpits, strapping themselves in, running through checklists with the mechanical precision of well-trained hands. You can imagine them lifting off into the dawn, confident and scared and alive, not knowing that for some of them, that morning flight would be the last time they felt the solid deck beneath their boots. And if you imagine hard enough, and you can see them returning, fuel gauges in the red, eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of their carrier. You can see the moment when they realize it is not there, when the radio calls go unanswered, when the awful mathematics of fuel and distance and time make themselves known. You can see the choice crystallizing in their minds. Try for another deck, ditch in the water, or simply fly until the engine quits and gravity takes over. This is the nightmare that the marble does not record. This is the moment when the promise of return becomes a lie, when the machinery of war reveals itself as fragile, when the ocean opens its arms and pulls young men down into darkness. The American military-industrial complex, that vast engine of production that Dwight Eisenhower would later warn about, it was built on a foundation of abundance. Factories could produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Shipyards could turn out aircraft by the thousands. Oil refineries could pump fuel without pause. This abundance was America's greatest weapon, the thing that allowed her to fight wars on multiple continents simultaneously, to supply allies across the globe, to simply outlast and outproduce any enemy. But abundance is not the same as invulnerability. The men of the Liscum Bay learned this in the most visceral way possible. They had believed that their carrier, backed by the full might of American industry, was unsinkable. They had believed that the Navy's logistics and planning would keep them safe. They had believed, as all soldiers must believe, that someone, somewhere, had thought of everything. Sure, the torpedo from the E-175 shattered that belief in an instant. All the factories in Detroit, all the oil wells in Texas, all the planning at the Pentagon could not save the Liscombe Bay once the bomb magazine ignited, and all the training and courage of the pilots could not keep their aircraft aloft once the fuel ran dry. This is the paradox of modern warfare, that it demands both total commitment to the machinery of destruction and an acceptance of its fundamental fragility. The pilots trusted their aircraft, and their aircraft betrayed them when the fuel ran out. The sailors trusted their carrier, and their carrier became a tomb. The nation trusted its industrial might, and that might proved insufficient to save 644 men from drowning. In the decades since Tarawa, historians have debated the tactics of the Central Pacific Campaign. He questioned the necessity of certain assaults, calculated the costs in blood and steel. The invasion of Tarawa itself was controversial, a tiny atoll purchased at the price of over 3,000 American casualties. Some argued it was essential for the drive toward Japan. Others called it unnecessary, a product of inter-service rivalry and strategic inflexibility. But whatever the strategic merits of Tarawa, the loss of the Liscombe Bay cannot be debated. It was a disaster, pure and simple. A submarine attack that found its mark, a magazine explosion that could not be contained, a ship that sank too fast for most of her crew to escape. The only questions are the ones that have no answers. Why that ship? Why that moment? Why those 644 men and not others? Robert Hartley lived with those questions for the rest of his life. Yet he knew that a simple personnel transfer, a routine paperwork shuffle, had saved him. He knew that the men he had worked beside, laughed with, complained about Navy food with, had died while he lived. There is a particular guilt that comes with survival, a weight that sits heavy on the chest and asks in the quiet hours before dawn, why me? Why was I spared when better men died? He never found an answer. There is no answer. Luck is not justice, and survival is not reward. It simply is. The pilots who survived the loss of their carrier went on to fly other missions from other ships. Some became aces. Some were shot down over other islands, other oceans. Some made it home and tried to build normal lives, carrying with them the memory of that morning when they returned from combat to find their home had vanished. In their nightmares, and they circled forever over empty ocean, fuel gauges dropping, radio calls echoing into silence. In their nightmares, the carrier was always just over the horizon, just out of reach, a promise that receded faster than they could fly. In their nightmares, the engine coughed and died, and the nose dropped and the water rushed up to meet them, cold and final. Some learned to live with the nightmares. Some did not. The casualty lists from the Pacific do not include the names of men who came home and put pistols in their mouths, or drove their cars off bridges, or simply faded away into alcoholism and despair. The official histories do not count them among the dead, but they died in the Pacific just as surely as the men who went down with the Liscombe Bay. They just took longer to drown. There is a moment, is preserved in the action reports and deck logs, that captures something essential about what happened that day. At 09:15 hours, a wildcat from the Liscombe Bay approached the USS Coral Sea with its fuel tank reading empty. The pilot, Ensign Thomas Riley, made his approach perfectly, speed correct, altitude correct, lineup centered. He caught the number 3 wire and rolled to a stop. Deck crews rushed forward to chock his wheels and begin the process of re-spotting his aircraft. But Riley did not climb out of his cockpit. He sat there, hands still on the stick, staring straight ahead. The plane captain climbed up and tapped on the canopy. No response. Finally, they slid the canopy back and found Riley still strapped in, conscious but unmoving. When they asked if he was injured, he shook his head slowly. But when they asked if he could exit the aircraft, he nodded but did not move. It took 3 men to help him out of the cockpit. His legs would not support his weight. He had not been wounded. He had not been injured in the landing. He had simply reached the absolute limit of what a human nervous system can endure, and his body had stopped taking orders from his brain. They carried him to sickbay, where the flight surgeon examined him and found nothing physically wrong. The diagnosis, written in careful medical handwriting on the report: acute nervous exhaustion. Riley never flew again. He spent the rest of the war in administrative positions, pushing papers and filing reports. He did not request a transfer back to flight status. He did not speak about what he had experienced. He simply stopped being a pilot, and as if that part of his life had ended the moment his aircraft ran out of fuel and he realized his carrier was gone. This is what war does, in the end. It takes men who believed themselves capable of anything, young men who had learned to master machines that could kill or save with equal ease, and it shows them the limits of their control. It shows them that courage and skill are sometimes insufficient, that survival can be a matter of random chance, that the machinery they trusted can fail in ways that leave them helpless. The German Wehrmacht learned this at Stalingrad, watching their supply aircraft fail to deliver enough food and ammunition to sustain an entire army. The Japanese learned it across the Pacific, as American submarines cut their supply lines and left garrisons to starve on islands that became prisons. Every army, as every air force, every navy eventually learns that the logistical tail that sustains combat operations is both essential and fragile. But there is something uniquely terrible about learning this lesson in an aircraft over the open ocean. A soldier on the ground can dig in, can conserve his ammunition, can make his supplies last. A pilot cannot. When the fuel is gone, the aircraft falls. There is no middle ground, no way to stretch the last gallons by being clever or disciplined. The physics are absolute. And so the pilots of the Liscombe learned what their counterparts in the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had already discovered: that to fly is to be utterly dependent on a chain of supply and support that stretches from the factory floor to the flight deck. Break any link in that chain, sink the carrier, just destroy the fuel depot, kill the mechanics, and the entire system collapses. In the years after the war, aviation technology advanced at a pace that would have seemed impossible in 1943. Jets replaced propeller-driven aircraft. Radar and guided missiles made air combat more complex and more lethal. Carriers grew larger and more sophisticated, with angled flight decks and steam catapults and nuclear reactors that could run for years without refueling. But the fundamental equation remained unchanged. Aircraft must return to a carrier. The carrier must be there. If it is not, the pilots face the same choice that confronted the men of the Liscombe Bay: find another place to land or die. Modern pilots train for this scenario. They practice emergency landings on unfamiliar decks, learn the procedures for ditching in the ocean. They memorize the locations of tanker aircraft that can provide in-flight refueling. The Navy has built redundancy into every system, created backup plans for the backup plans. But redundancy is not certainty. For every procedural safeguard, there is a scenario in which it fails. For every backup plan, there is a disaster that falls outside its parameters. The Liscombe Bay taught the Navy that even the best-laid plans can unravel in seconds. The torpedo that killed her did not care about procedures or redundancy. It did not care about the training manuals or the tactical doctrine. It struck, it exploded, and 644 men died. And the pilots who launched from her deck that morning learned that the sky, for all its apparent freedom, is actually a cage with invisible bars made of fuel capacity and distance and time. And there's a particular kind of silence that descends when you run out of fuel at altitude. The engine coughs, sputters, and then dies. The propeller windmills in the slipstream, still spinning but providing no thrust. The aircraft, suddenly powerless, becomes a glider, elegant and doomed. The pilot can feel the stick go lighter in his hands, the responsiveness bleeding away as airspeed drops. He can watch the altimeter unwind, the numbers spinning backward as the earth reaches up to claim him. In that silence, there is a clarity that combat never provides. No gunfire, no radio chatter, no controlled chaos of a dogfight. Just the whisper of wind over the wings, the creak of the airframe, and the pounding of blood in the pilot's ears. In that silence, every decision crystallizes into stark simplicity, up or down, life or death. The pilots of the Liscome Bay experienced that silence over and over on November 20th, 1943. Each one, as his fuel gauge dropped into the red, as his engine began to cough, heard the sudden quiet and knew what it meant. Some found decks to land on. Some found life rafts and rescue. Some found only water. But all of them, even those who survived, carried that silence with them for the rest of their lives. In quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats, they could hear it again. The wind, the creaking airframe, the engine dying. They could feel the stick going light in their hands, could see the fuel gauge reading 0, could remember the cold certainty that they were about to die, not because of enemy action, but because the simple mathematics of war had turned against them. The story of the Liscome Bay is not a story of heroes and villains. Commander Tabata was not evil. He was a submarine commander doing his duty, hunting enemy ships in wartime. The American sailors and pilots were not angels. They were young men sent to fight a war that most of them barely understood, in a place most of them had never heard of before December 7th, 1941. It is simply a story of what happens when the machinery of war functions as designed, and also when it fails catastrophically. The submarine found its target. The torpedo found the magazine. The magazine exploded. The carrier sank. The pilots returned to empty ocean. Each step followed logically from the previous one, an inexorable chain of cause and effect that no one could have stopped once it began. This is the true nightmare of modern warfare. Not that it is cruel or chaotic, but that it is mechanical and predictable. The same industrial processes that produce carriers in vast numbers also make them vulnerable to single points of failure. The same abundance that allows a nation to fight across the globe also creates dependencies that can be exploited. The same training that teaches pilots to fly with precision also teaches them to trust systems that can betray them. Robert Hartley died in 1987 at the age of 64 of a heart attack. His funeral was small and quiet, attended by family and a few friends from the plant where he had worked. No one from the Navy came. No one gave a eulogy about his service in the Pacific. He was buried in a civilian cemetery under a simple headstone that listed his name, his dates, and nothing else. But in his dresser drawer, hidden beneath old sweaters and never mentioned to anyone, his wife found a photograph after his death. It showed a group of young men in Navy uniforms standing on a carrier flight deck, squinting into the sun and grinning. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Liscome Bay Crew, October, 1943. She studied the faces for a long time, trying to pick out her husband among the young sailors. But they all looked so similar, so young, so confident, so unaware of what was coming, that she could not be certain which one was him. In the end, she placed the photograph in the casket before they closed it, so that whatever ghosts still haunted him might finally be laid to rest. The dead of the Liscome Bay do not ask for remembrance. They do not demand monuments or memorials. Yes, they are beyond such things, beyond the reach of history and honor and all the ways the living try to make meaning from loss. But the living carry them still, in photographs hidden in drawers, in nightmares that echo across decades, in the silence that descends when the fuel runs dry and the engine dies and there is nothing left but gravity and water and the long fall down. This is what happened when the carrier decks ran dry. This is the landing that became a nightmare. This is the moment when young men learned that all the power and abundance and technological might in the world cannot save you when the mathematics of war turn against you, when the ocean swallows your home, when the sky that promised freedom becomes a cage. And this is what freedom costs in the end, not just the dead, but the survivors who carry their ghosts. It's not just the ships that sink, but the memories that refuse to drown. Not just the battles we win, but the nightmares we inherit, circling forever over empty ocean, fuel gauges reading 0, calling for a home that will never answer.